Hi, my name is Amy Denney, and I am your facilitator for the class Stress Less. I am a certified trauma sensitive Holy Yoga instructor, as well as a certified Holy Yoga instructor. So, what that means is, in total, I've been through more than 300 hours of training in Holy Yoga, including the emphasis on trauma care, trauma-informed care, as well as having participated in a lot of different workshops and other education. So the two books that I studied and my trauma sensitive certification is are Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga and The Body Keeps the Score. So The Body Keeps the Score is more of a textbook, has some great illustrations and real life examples in it, but is pretty academically heavy. Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga is an awesome book that I recommend for anybody who wants to utilize any of the tools of yoga, breath, movement, to overcome any type of stress whatsoever, and especially trauma. And we're going to go into the difference between trauma and stress in just a moment. So this class has 9 units. Each of the 9 units is going to have its own homework assignment, including a practice that you can do as long as you want before you move forward to the next unit. So you can kind of skip through these really quickly. You can spend some time, maybe exploring each topic for a week, which is what I would recommend, or at least several days. But this is for you to go at your own pace. The topics of each unit are divided into categories of types of anxiety and the way that you can overcome that anxiety. So specifically identified reactions that we have in our bodies to stress, and then what we can do in our bodies to overcome that stress. So in other words, a tool for that specific type of anxiety. So what I don't want you to do is pick the ones that you think you're struggling with and only do those. I want you to come at this with a really open mind and an open heart and explore each of these, because you just never know what might be useful to you until you've given it your attention. So that's my plea to you. I have been a lifelong struggler with stress, and have had many different physical manifestations of my stress. One of the earliest ones that I can recall having panic attacks as a child. When I was in high school, I had chewed on ice and plastic straws for so long that my jaw, and I was clenching my jaw at night because of stress, that I had to have orthodontic work. I had actually knocked my jaw completely out of alignment, and I had TMJ disorder, so excruciating pain and really messed up jaw. So that was one of the early indicators of stress. But I've noticed highs and lows throughout my life of when I'm handling stress well and when I'm not, to the point that even most recently I had a baby at age 40. And while I was nursing her, I could tell when I was under a lot of stress because she couldn't sleep. And in fact, she was actually having night terrors at one point. So that connection between my body and her body was pretty strong. And like I said, I was nursing her, so that might have accounted for it. But even beyond nursing, when I'm feeling stress, the people in my home are feeling some of that too. So it's important for me to be mindful of my own self-care, because it's not even just about me anymore. It affects my relationships with the people I love. It affects my mental well-being, my physical well-being, and my spiritual well-being. And we'll talk about that integrated approach as we go on. So welcome. The more you participate out of this class, the more you'll get out of it. So in our private group, I hope that you will introduce yourself, but I also totally understand if you're not ready to do that. So you be you and come at this with an open mind, and reach out anytime you have any questions whatsoever. I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share and get our slideshow going for our first class. So we are on Unit 1, and this is kind of an overview and sort of foundational to all of yoga, and that is to notice. So always we want to approach our body and our mind with grace. And part of the way that we do that is by just coming to notice. In a yoga class, it might be the very first thing that an instructor asks you to do. It's just to notice. Notice your breath. Notice what kinds of thoughts you're having or what kinds of thoughts you've been having that day and how that has impacted you, and then to notice your body, not only areas of injury and tension, but even just noticing your body in that very moment, being present on your mat and noticing. So that's where we begin, and we will come back to this theme of noticing throughout. So a lot of the homework will be involving noticing various areas of stress and anxiety as we move forward through each of the topics. So one of the things I want to encourage you to do is to put a more positive spin on stress. So defined by the dictionary, stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. And I think you can agree that defined that way, we probably all have experienced stress at some point or another in our life. In fact, it would be unusual if we didn't resonate with that definition on some level or another. But there are various types of stress, but stress is designed as part of our makeup to be something that actually protects us. Stress gives us that instinct to fight or flee traumatic situations. So there's a huge benefit to stress. And even in our modern living, stress is something that can help you overcome a deadline or get through a project when applied in a more mindful way. So it's not completely your adversary. So I want you to think about the fact that you can utilize stress to your benefit and being mindful and noticing when your stress is crossing a line to impacting you beyond just your mind in that moment, but impacting your body and your spirit. So there are 3 different types of stress. Acute stress, which is short term, it's typically just one incident. This morning, my daughter had her first day of a program that is totally new and kind of grown up. She's a senior in high school, and she had a little bit of stress this morning. I was pretty impressed because after a lifetime of dealing with stress, she actually had it under control pretty well, but admitted that it would be hard for her to eat breakfast because she had some butterflies in her stomach. First days are always stressful, just that stress of the unknown. So typically an incident could be something more traumatic, like a car accident would be something in the short term, but could certainly create lasting impacts. One of the fascinating things about stress to me is that my mom was driving on an interstate through St. Louis. I was in the passenger seat with her, and my 2 daughters were in the back seat. One of them is a teenager, and the other one was in a car seat. My little one should have been rear facing, but we took my mom's car instead of mine. So she had already had a car seat in. It was forward facing. She was really close to being able to turn, so I just let it go. And of course, we had this car accident. And it was a multiple car accident where somebody hit somebody in the line, and it kind of went forward, and we were the second car from the front. Not major damage, a little jarring, but nothing major. I wasn't concerned at all. The only kind of trauma that I might have had was that my mom wanted to stay on the interstate, and we were over another lane, and people were buzzing around us rather fast, and I was concerned about staying on the highway, so I was encouraging her to get off the highway. But other than that, I had no long-term impacts from that. That was just an acute stress. My mother, on the other hand, has had more of a chronic situation going on, or an episodic acute stress, because now every time she drives on that stretch of the interstate, she is triggered by that car accident. And anytime somebody gets really close in her rearview mirror, it's also a trigger. So these short-term situations, while temporary, can also cause lasting impacts on our body. So we're storing that memory in our body, and then we're reacting to triggers. The second type of stress is chronic. So life circumstances, for instance, living in war, poverty, or racism. Specifically, poverty. One of the things I noticed last summer, I was honored to teach yoga to children in a homeless program. And many of them live in life circumstances that are far from ideal. In fact, once I realized that I was giving them permission to just come to their mat and breathe like I would in any trauma class. At first, I really wanted them to listen to me and to do the yoga because I knew it would be really good for them. And I realized that being bossy and controlling is the last thing I should really be doing, especially for kids who are living in trauma. So I went back to my roots as a trauma teacher and said, listen, the rule is you stay on your mat and you breathe. If you don't want to do the cues I'm suggesting, don't do them. If you don't want to do the breathing work, don't do it. And what happened is many of the children actually fell asleep on their mat. And when I talked to the director of the program, she told me that that was a real blessing, that I would give them a safe place to do that was a blessing to them, because they may be living in homes and situations where they don't feel safe at night to sleep. And so they're up listening to abuse or being abused, or just really, chronic traumatic situations at home that prevent them from getting the rest that they need. So that would be chronic. And then lastly is the episodic acute. So when your life is overburdened, and it's feeding chronic and acute stress. And this is the kind of stress that can lead to disease, such as heart disease and depression. So this might be something like a job, or just a general unhappiness with life that's causing this overburdened feeling and potentially leading to disease. One of my early students in a yoga class at the Y came to me after just a few months and told me that he was able to get off blood pressure medication because of the breath work and meditation that we were teaching and doing in yoga class that he came to twice a week. I was super impressed by that. So these tools can work. So I hope you will stick with me so that you can find out what might be super beneficial for you. And this almost always, hang on. Sorry, misfire there. Oops. So talking a little bit more about stress. Fight, flight, freeze, and submit. And you've probably heard of fight and flight. Both, all of them have very specific neurophysiological reactions. In fight, the person is working to repel a threat. So the emotions that go along with that might be anger or rage. Freeze, your body is actively trying to get away from the threat. And the emotions in that situation may be anxiety and fear. And coping is an avoidance versus approach. So you may want to avoid the situation, you may want to approach the situation. Either way, that's the way your body is trying to cope with the stress. And then freeze is interesting because it involves both the sympathetic nervous system and potentially the parasympathetic nervous system. So in nature, what that means is an animal may play dead when you freeze, and that slows down the heart rate and the respiration so that they can truly get into the position of being dead. And freeze is a lot like that. So it may tap into a little bit of the parasympathetic nervous system, but that doesn't make it any less stressful. And then submit is similar to freeze in that the body is making endogenous opioids that mediate pain perception and alter reality. And that allows the victim to disconnect from the experience and the aggressor. So, 4 different things. Your body and your brain are designed to do what is best in that situation. So a lot of that, just like breathing, can be controlled, but often is an automatic response in the body. Stress has its own pathway that you may or may not have any control over. So one of the things with victims of trauma is holding a shame or a guilt over the way that they responded. And so some of the tools are designed to specifically almost allow a reenactment of that trauma or stress so that the body can rewrite the pathway as it wants to. But the reality is God has designed us in such a way that there is no wrong or right way to respond to trauma or stress. There's just simply a response. And while we can use some tools to try to do things differently in the future, your body is just going to go into an automatic mode that makes the most sense for you. So with that, I wanted to share this video. Oops. It popped up already, which is a dad who taught his daughter how to respond to bombs. How awesome is that, you guys? So powerful. What an amazing dad, truly. When I think about all the different ways that stress has bogged me down, and even though I'm 46, really want to teach my children that they can choose a different response. And there are days when I succeed at that, and there are days that are just dang hard. So we want to always give ourselves grace. Earlier, I defined stress out of the dictionary for you. I want to define trauma and talk about how it's very similar. So trauma is something that is deeply distressing or disturbing. It's an experience that's deeply distressing or disturbing. And specifically, there is a list of criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder that must be met for the diagnosis. And I am going to read through that briefly, but I want to encourage you that if you feel like your stress is kind of leaning into trauma, this course will be good for you, without a doubt. However, I do want to recommend that you also talk to or see a counselor, a psychologist, to work through the trauma as well with a top-down approach. And I'll talk about different approaches in just a moment. But it's important that that you realize that this class is a complement to, not a replacement for, traditional therapy. An amazing tools to have in your toolbox, and some things that you are not going to learn with a counselor. But certainly if you're suffering from trauma, I am not a trained counselor, and that is something that I believe you may want to look into. So let's talk about what those criteria are, so you'll know a little bit more about whether or not trauma is something that is a concern for you right now. So these are the criteria. The first one is stressor, and one is required from the list that I'm going to read for the diagnosis. The person was exposed to death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following ways. One of these: direct exposure, witnessing the trauma, learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to a trauma, indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma, usually in the course of a professional duty, such as a first responder or medic. The second criteria, intrusion symptoms, and one is required from this list. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in the following ways: unwanted, upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress after exposure to traumatic reminders or triggers, physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic reminders or triggers. The third criterion, avoidance, one is required. Avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the trauma in the following ways: trauma-related thoughts or feelings, trauma-related external reminders, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, which is underneath intrusion. Two are required off of this list: negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways: inability to recall key features of the trauma, overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world, exaggerated blame of self or others for causing trauma, a negative affect, decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, and difficulty experiencing positive affect. Moving below that, alterations in arousal and reactivity is another criteria. Trauma-related arousal and reactivity that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways: irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, and difficulty sleeping. Duration, the symptoms have to last for more than 1 month, and that's a requirement. Functional significance, symptoms create distress or functional impairment. So in other words, they're interrupting your social life, relationships, occupation. And then exclusion, symptoms are not due to medication, substance abuse, or other illness. So those things must be ruled out. And then the specify if dissociative or delayed expression. So the dissociative specification: in addition to meeting criteria for diagnosis, an individual experiences high levels of either of the following in reaction to trauma-related stimuli. They depersonalize, so they have an experience of being an outside observer of or detached from oneself, or derealization, experience of unreality, distance, or distortion. In other words, things are not real. And then delayed specification: full diagnostic criteria are not met until at least 6 months after the trauma, even if the onset of symptoms may occur immediately. And that's the delayed specification or expression. So that is PTSD. So if that is something that concerns you, make sure you do reach out to somebody and chat about that a little bit more in depth. Feel free to reach out to me, and I will be glad to talk you through that. All right, so this class is all about providing safe coping tools, and I want to talk a little bit about what these tools, what the goal is, this bottom-up approach. So I talked about talk therapy being a top-down approach. So when you talk it out, everything is in your mind. So the tool is the mind, the conversation, the discussion. Whereas with the tools of yoga, we're looking at a bottom-up approach. So that means we are using the body and then working our way up to and integrating the mind. This class is designed to be a safe experience to help you learn how to deal with the impacts of stress or trauma from your past, and also to give you tools for coping in the future. It's intended for you to gain awareness into how trauma has affected your body, and a safe place to explore that and to learn how emotions might be stored in the body. So remember, like my mom's triggers from the car accident, her body remembers, even if she's not constantly thinking about it, that trigger comes up when those certain situational triggers are there, then all of a sudden she'll remember. So yoga with the breath and meditation and movement is just a complement or an adjunct to learn healthier ways for coping with the burdens of life. We're going to use our breath, we're going to use our bodies, we're going to talk about emotions, and it's going to be an integrated exploration of self. So the idea is to be curious and to come with a curiosity about your body and your past and how you can help give yourself the best self-care. Charles Darwin, in his book, The Expressions of the Emotions in Man and Animals, found that if stuck in survival mode, an organism focused all of its energies on fighting off unseen enemies, leaving no room for nurture, care, and love. For humans whose mind is intent on defending invisible assaults, our closest relationships are threatened, along with our ability to imagine, play, and pay attention to other people and their needs. So yoga is a somatic experience that taps into the inner life. It is building or rebuilding a connection to self, because the stress doesn't just happen in the mind, but also in the body. Healing needs to occur in both spaces, and that's why these tools are so important. Your body is holding on to emotions, and yoga is a safe space to draw them out, and we're only going to give ourselves permission to deal with those things that the body and the mind and the spirit are ready to deal with. All right, let's talk about the brain a little bit. And remember, I am not a scientist or a therapist, but just want to share with you some tools. But understanding a little bit about the anatomy of the brain and how the brain works is going to hopefully start to help you see how these tools are going to be really powerful. All right, so the medial prefrontal cortex is a part of the frontal cortex, a lobe that helps organize thoughts, so we know when things are really a threat. It keeps us from freaking out when the smoke alarm goes off in the middle of the night because our teens are making pizza rolls. That happens in my house a lot. So it's just this little part of the brain that says, oh, there's not a fire, your house isn't burning down, it's just your kids making pizza rolls, so that you don't go ballistic every single time you hear the smoke alarm when pizza rolls are being made. Stress of any kind can damage the medial prefrontal cortex. So every time we're exposed to stress, we're damaging that alarm system that tells us when things are truly a danger. And interestingly enough, mindfulness is strengthening that area. So while it may be damaged, there is something that we can actively do to undo the damage that's being done and respond better, create a healthier, stronger alarm system. Sorry, I have to keep moving myself. All right. So the gut feeling is all about being aware. Always trust your gut. If you feel something is wrong, that's because it usually is. I'm sure you've heard of the expression of a gut feeling. But you have to notice your gut for it to do its job. And the same thing with the body. So in order to gain back control of the body and some of the effects that stress has had on your body and your brain, it's time to turn our attention inward and start to feel and understand sensations and kind of get to know our own brain, that alarm system, and scanning for any things that are kind of in or moving toward dysfunction and pulling them back to optimum functionality. So mindfulness is going to rebuild that inner compass, and it all starts with this simple act of noticing that we are beginning on. So we are going to go ahead and do our first exercise in noticing. So wherever you are, grab a seat, or if you're in your bed, get comfy, lay back on your back. We're going to focus on the feet. So if you have shoes on, maybe kick those off, kick off your socks and shoes. So I want you to really be able to feel and notice right now. If you're in a chair, bring your bottom to the very edge of the chair so that you have an alert spine, a straight spine, and your feet are able to touch and connect with the floor. If you're laying in your bed, bend your knees so that your knees are pointing up to the ceiling and your feet are flat on the bed. And then you can just drop your knees together to rest on one another. That will take some of the pressure off your low back too. It's a really nice posture. If it's helpful for you, close your eyes or focus on an unmoving object, just something to give your eyes rest and focus. We'll begin our practice. So let's just start by noticing the breath. Noticing how fast or slow. Noticing what parts of the body rise and fall or expand and contract. Good, and let's start to bring our mind's eye to our feet. Can you feel any sensation where the foot or your feet are touching the ground, the floor, the bed? Where are those points? What does it feel like? What does it feel like if you add movement? Maybe lifting all 5 toes on both feet and then dropping them back, down, back and forth, or maybe dropping 1 toe at a time. Pinky toe, 4th toe, middle toe, 2nd toe, big toe. Or perhaps tapping your heels. And if you notice nothing, that's okay. There's no right or wrong, no judgment, no shame. It's just a practice. Maybe moving around and exploring will start to bring some sensation to that connection. If you're lying down or sitting, what parts of your back body do you feel connecting? Does it feel heavy or soft? Does it feel different if you shift your weight from one sits bone to the other, or one shoulder blade to the other if you're on your back? And when you're done, we will end this exercise, this practice of noticing. You take a moment to scratch down some notes if you want about how that felt, what you noticed. Journaling is a powerful tool that also helps with mindfulness. So take the time to write that down. If not now, maybe later. So here's our homework for Unit 1. Do your trauma assessment from your email. And then after you do that, kind of go back and look over it. What things did you notice? Were there surprises or affirmations? And is that information useful to you? I'll share with you when I did mine, I noticed a trend that a lot of different traumatic things happened to me around ages 5 and 6. Now, they were not major traumatic things, but there were quite a few things that were layered on top of one another. And it was enough for me to kind of peel back some layers of personality issues, I guess I would call it, that started to develop in me as a child. So I became very shy, very introverted, very introspective, and those were not necessarily traits that I had before that. So just kind of finding those connections, just noticing, not to cast judgment or shame, not at all, just to notice. And then, of course, the usefulness being, okay, so if I started becoming shy, am I really shy? Is that part of who I am? Maybe I was going to be shy anyway. Could these situations have created a different personality trait in me? So just peeling that back. And then your second homework assignment is to take the self-care inventory. This is just a long laundry list of different ways to take care of yourself. These are things that are more needed than wanted. We're not talking about massages and coloring your hair and having a glass of wine. We're talking about actual self-care, sleeping and moving, those kinds of things. And then just taking stock of that after you do the inventory. It's not a test, there's no right or wrong, but are there places that you feel you could invest more time or energy? Are there things you want to change? And then thirdly, doing the video practice that goes along with this unit. So I'm just going to leave you a few minutes here to scratch down any notes that you have and just a few quotes that go along with noticing. And I will just add, recently I have been studying about mindfulness and discovered that some 97 to 98% of our thoughts are actually repetitive and useless, which is very fascinating. So it kind of begs the question, what things are we putting in our mind, and what are we noticing? What are we feeding ourselves as truth from all of those thoughts, and what things are we maybe believing that are not true about ourselves? So thoughts are super powerful, and just beginning to notice what we're putting in and how that's impacting us can be pretty profound. So that is it for Unit 1. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you soon in Unit 2.